The late afternoon sun hung low over Route 17, bleeding gold across the cracked asphalt. Traffic was light, the road quiet, except for the occasional hum of passing cars. A black sedan rolled steadily down the lane, its windows half open to let in the fading warmth of the day. Behind the wheel sat James Whitaker, dressed simply in a plain collared shirt and pressed slacks. His posture was upright but relaxed, his eyes calm as they scanned the horizon. He had just left the Veterans Hospital after visiting an old friend. His mind was still replaying their conversation when the sharp wail of a police siren cut through the stillness. James glanced into the rearview mirror. A white patrol car followed closely, its lights flashing. He frowned slightly, signaling as he eased the car to the shoulder of the road. Behind him, Officer Rick Harris pulled his cruiser to a stop. He stepped out slowly, adjusting his belt, his hand brushing the holster of his firearm as if by reflex. His gaze fixed on the black sedan with a certain hardness, a familiarity of assumption rather than observation. As Rick approached the driver's window, his tone was clipped, authoritative. "License and registration." James turned his head calmly, his movements slow and deliberate. "Is there a reason I was stopped, officer?" Rick's eyes narrowed. "License and registration," he repeated, his voice firmer this time. Without a word, James reached into the glove compartment, retrieved his documents, and handed them over. His expression remained neutral, but his steady gaze made Rick pause for half a second. Rick glanced at the papers, then back at James. "Do you know how fast you were going?" "Yes," James said evenly. "Within the limit." Rick smirked faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "You sure about that?" "Yes," James replied. His voice never wavered. Rick shifted his stance, scanning the car's interior. "Where are you headed?" "Home," James answered simply. Rick's gaze lingered on the back seat, where a neatly folded military jacket sat. Its insignia gleamed faintly in the light. "What's that?" Rick asked, nodding toward it. "A uniform," James said. Rick's smirk deepened. "Yours?" "Yes." For a moment, Rick just stared, as if trying to reconcile the calm man before him with the preconceptions running quietly through his mind. "Step out of the vehicle," Rick said finally. James didn't move immediately. "Am I being detained?" Rick's tone sharpened. "Step out, now." James opened the door slowly, his movements precise, controlled. He stood beside the car, taller than Rick expected, his presence quiet but commanding. Rick gestured toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." James complied without argument, his expression still composed. But as Rick circled the camera, his eyes caught something he hadn't noticed before, tucked carefully in the small display case on the passenger seat. A glint of gold, a Medal of Honor. For a split second, Rick froze. The medal's golden sheen caught the dying sunlight, and even from a distance, he recognized it. Few people didn't, the Medal of Honor. It sat inside a small, velvet-lined case, pristine, deliberate, as if it had been placed there for safekeeping, not for show. Rick blinked, his jaw tightening. He masked the moment with a shallow cough and stepped closer to the driver's side. "What's this?" he asked, though his tone had lost a fraction of its earlier bite. James glanced briefly toward the case. "An award," he said simply. Rick's brow furrowed. "Where'd you get it?" James's gaze met his with the same calm intensity. Afghanistan. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Rick shifted uncomfortably, trying to hold on to the authority that had felt so certain just moments ago. "You're military?" Rick asked, his voice quieter now. "Retired," James answered. Rick's eyes flicked back to the medal. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just a veteran. This was someone who had done something extraordinary, something only a handful of soldiers ever lived to be recognized for. Still, pride and habit pushed against the flicker of respect building in Rick's chest. He straightened his shoulders, grasping for control. "Why is it sitting on the seat like that?" James tilted his head slightly. "Because I just left a hospital. I visited a friend. He served with me. He didn't come back the same." Rick said nothing. James's voice was even, but there was a weight behind it. "I planned to take the medal to his family, to remind them his sacrifice wasn't forgotten." Rick's throat tightened. He glanced at the military jacket in the back seat again, noticing for the first time the name tag stitched above the breast pocket, Whitaker, J. Still, pride was a stubborn thing. "Look, I pulled you over because—" "Because of what?" James interrupted softly. There was no aggression in his tone, only a quiet challenge. Rick hesitated. The rehearsed answers, speeding, suspicion, routine, check, all felt hollow now. "Because you saw me," James said, finishing the thought for him. "Not the car, not the road, just me." Rick opened his mouth, but no words came. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of another car passing on the distant highway. The world felt strangely still around them. James didn't move, didn't flinch. He stood there with the quiet composure of someone who had faced far greater threats than a roadside stop. "You've already run my license," James said calmly. "It's clean, so what now?" Rick stared at him, the weight of the moment pressing heavier with every passing second. The authority he'd leaned on so easily was slipping. He handed the license back slowly. "You're free to go." James studied him for a moment, then took the license with a small nod. But before he opened the door to return to his car, he said one last thing, his voice soft, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "Respect shouldn't depend on what you see after the fact." Rick swallowed hard. For the first time, he couldn't disagree. James slipped back into the driver's seat, the car door closing with a quiet click. He placed the license carefully on the dashboard and rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Behind him, Rick stood frozen by the patrol car. The flashing lights reflected faintly off his sunglasses, but his eyes were distant. Staring at the metal, he could still see through the window. He'd made dozens of stops like this one. Routine, unthinking, but this time felt different. In his mind, questions churned. Who was this man, really? What had he done to earn that medal? And why had I assumed? He cut the thought short, jaw tightening. James started the engine slowly. The soft hum of the car filled the silence. Before pulling onto the road, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. Rick was still standing there, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but uncertain, almost uneasy. James didn't offer a wave or a nod. He simply eased the car back into traffic, the black sedan gliding smoothly down the sunlit stretch of road. Rick watched until the car disappeared from sight. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant echo of tires on asphalt. Finally, Rick exhaled and walked back to his cruiser. He sat heavily in the driver's seat, his hands resting on the steering wheel. His radio crackled to life. "Unit 45, report. Everything clear?" He hesitated before pressing the button. "Clear," he said finally, his voice flat. But it wasn't clear, not in his head. As he sat there, his eyes drifted to the small medal pinned to his own dashboard. Nothing like the one he'd just seen, just a routine commendation for years of service. Suddenly, it felt insignificant. Meanwhile, miles ahead, James pulled into a quiet neighborhood. He parked outside a modest home with a neatly trimmed lawn and stepped out, carrying the velvet metal case with careful hands. An older woman opened the door before he knocked. Her eyes softened when she saw him. "James," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Mrs. Daniels," James replied gently. "I came to bring you something." He opened the case, revealing the Medal of Honor. The woman's hands covered her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "It belonged to him," James said softly. "Your son earned it. I kept it safe after we lost him. I thought it was time it came home." She reached out, fingers brushing the medal as her shoulders shook. "He always said you were like a brother to him." James nodded silently, his gaze lowering. Back on the highway, Rick still sat in his cruiser. He thought about how quickly he had acted on an assumption, how easily he had turned authority into suspicion without reason. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, he didn't like what he saw staring back. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he couldn't stop thinking about the quiet man with the medal on the seat beside him. The sun dipped lower, washing the quiet neighborhood in a warm, amber glow. Inside Mrs. Daniels's living room, the walls were lined with framed photos. Her son in uniform, smiling beside his unit, medals neatly displayed beneath glass. James stood in the center of the room, holding the Medal of Honor in both hands before placing it gently on the mantel. Mrs. Daniels wiped her eyes, her voice soft. "I didn't think I'd ever see it again." "It was always his," James said quietly, "but after what happened, there wasn't anyone left to bring it back. So I kept it safe. For you." She touched the medal, her fingers trembling. "He would have wanted you to have it, you know. You saved him more times than you can count." James looked away, his jaw tightening. Not the last time. Silence hung between them for a moment. Mrs. Daniels stepped closer, her eyes kind, despite the years of grief etched into them. "You both fought for something bigger than yourselves. That's what matters." James gave a faint nod. "I just did what needed to be done." Meanwhile, miles away on Route 17, Rick still sat in his patrol car, the hum of the idling engine filling the empty silence. His mind replayed the encounter like a broken reel. The calm way James had looked at him, the quiet strength in his voice, the sharp truth of his words. Respect shouldn't depend on what you see after the fact. Rick glanced at the body cam clipped to his chest. The footage was still recording, just another routine stop in the department's archives. He thought about erasing it, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way James's eyes had made him feel, or maybe it was the uncomfortable realization of how many times he had pulled someone over the same way. He reached for the radio. "Dispatch," he said, his voice hesitant. Cancel my patrol for the next hour. I need a moment. Copy that, the voice on the other end replied, confused but unquestioning. Rick turned off the engine and sat in the stillness. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he could go back to doing his job the same way. Back at Mrs. Daniels Heiko's house, James finally took a seat. She brought out an old photo album, flipping through pictures of her son's childhood, his first day in uniform, the day he shipped out overseas. He always talked about you, she said. Said you never let the team lose hope, even when it was bad out there. James managed a faint smile. Hope is all we had some days. Outside, the evening breeze rustled the trees. The world felt quiet, heavy but at peace. As James stood to leave, Mrs. Daniels followed him to the door. Thank you, James, she said softly. Not just for this, but for being there. For him. He nodded once, simply. Take care of it. He earned it more than anyone. When James stepped outside, the air felt cooler. He walked to his car, the metal case now empty, and slid behind the wheel. Somewhere on the same stretch of highway, Rick drove aimlessly, his patrol lights off. He didn't need another stop today. He needed to think about what kind of man he wanted to be when the uniform came off, and though neither of them knew it, their paths would cross again. Night settled slowly over the city, the streets lit by scattered pools of yellow light. James drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound inside the car. The seat beside him felt oddly empty now, without the metal case. For years, it had been a quiet weight he carried, both a memory and a responsibility. As he approached a red light, he glanced at the glove compartment where his discharge papers rested, folded neatly. Next to them was another letter, one he hadn't yet opened. It was from the Department of Veterans Affairs, probably another formal invitation to a ceremony or an interview he'd decline. He wasn't one for public recognition. The light turned green, but James didn't move immediately. He stared for a moment longer, then eased forward, merging back onto the highway. Meanwhile, Rick sat in his cruiser at a dimly lit gas station, the patrol car engine idling softly. He leaned back in the seat, staring at the steering wheel, his mind still circling the encounter from earlier. He thought about how sure he had been when he'd pulled James over, how automatic the decision had felt. He thought about the way the man had moved, slow, calm, precise, not out of fear, but discipline. Rick rubbed his face, trying to shake the unease gnawing at him. It wasn't the first time he'd made a stop like that, but for the first time, he couldn't push the guilt aside. On the small screen of his dashboard camera, the still image of James stepping out of the car stared back at him. The Medal of Honor case glinted faintly in the corner of the frame. Rick shut the screen off. Across town, James pulled into a small diner he frequented late at night. It was quiet, almost empty, just a couple of truck drivers sipping coffee in the corner. He slid into a booth near the back. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, approached. "Coffee?" "Please," James replied. When she returned with the steaming mug, she noticed the faint weariness in his face. "Long day?" "Something like that," he said softly. She didn't press, just gave a knowing nod before moving on to the next table. As he sipped his coffee, James noticed a small boy sitting with his mother across the room. The boy was fascinated by the patches on an old veteran's jacket sitting a table away. James watched as the veteran leaned down, smiling gently as he explained what each one meant. The sight stirred something deep in him, a quiet reminder of why he'd joined, why he'd fought, and why he still carried the memories of those who hadn't made it home. Outside the diner, Rick's patrol car slowed to a stop. He hadn't planned it, but somehow his route had led him here. Through the window, he spotted James sitting alone, sipping his coffee. For a moment, Rick just watched, unsure if he should go in. His instincts told him to keep driving. But something heavier, something harder to ignore, told him this wasn't finished yet. With a quiet sigh, Rick stepped out of the cruiser and walked toward the diner door. The bell above the entrance chimed softly as he stepped inside. The soft chime of the diner's doorbell drew James's attention. He looked up from his coffee just as Rick stepped inside, the officer's posture stiff and uncertain. The room was quiet enough that the faint squeak of Rick's boots on the tile felt loud. Rick paused near the entrance, his eyes scanning the room. When he spotted James in the back booth, their gazes met. James didn't flinch, didn't look away. He simply raised his cup slowly, taking another sip, as if he had expected this moment. For a second, Rick considered leaving. He could have turned around, walked back to the cruiser, and pretended he hadn't seen him. But something told him that walking away would feel worse than facing whatever came next. He approached the booth slowly. "Mind if I sit?" Rick asked, his voice low, almost cautious. James gestured to the empty seat across from him without a word. Rick slid into the booth. The waitress glanced over, but didn't say anything, sensing the weight between them. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the diner's refrigerator and the faint clink of dishes were the only sounds. "I wasn't expecting to see you again," James said finally, his tone calm but carrying an edge. Rick exhaled. "I wasn't planning on this, but I couldn't stop thinking about earlier." James said nothing, just watched him with that same steady gaze that had made Rick falter during the stop. Rick cleared his throat. "I shouldn't have pulled you over like that. I didn't have a reason. I saw you, and I assumed." The words hung heavy in the air. "You assumed because that's what you've always done," James replied quietly. "Not just with me." Rick's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Deep down, he knew it was true. "I've been on this job for 10 years, Rick said. "You start thinking you know who's trouble and who's not. You build patterns in your head. But today, that metal—" James leaned forward slightly. "The metal didn't change who I was. It just changed what you saw." Rick froze at the truth in those words. "I didn't need you to know I was a soldier," James continued. "I needed you to see me as a man, but you didn't." Rick lowered his gaze to the tabletop. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his badge, not as authority, but as responsibility. "I'm sorry," Rick said finally, the words quiet but genuine. James studied him for a moment before responding. "It's not me you need to say that to. It's everyone who didn't have a medal on their seat to make you hesitate." Rick felt the sting of the truth again. He had no defense. The waitress came by, placing a coffee in front of Rick without a word. She sensed the heaviness, the kind that didn't need to be explained. Rick wrapped his hands around the warm cup, staring at it. "I don't know if I can fix what I've done," he admitted. James didn't look away. "You can't. But you can change what you do next." Outside the diner, the street was empty. The night was quiet. Inside, two men sat across from each other, one who had carried the weight of war, and another who was just beginning to feel the weight of his own choices. The silence between them stretched. James sat calmly, his eyes fixed on Rick, while the officer gripped his coffee mug like it was the only thing grounding him. "I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone's dangerous," Rick finally said, his voice subdued. "But I'm starting to wonder if I was just seeing what I wanted to see." James leaned back slightly, his gaze still steady. "It's not about danger. It's about comfort. You got comfortable believing a certain story about people like me. It made your job easier, until today." Rick looked down, the steam from the coffee blurring his vision for a moment. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. "I always told myself I treated everyone the same," Rick murmured. "But I didn't. And I didn't even think twice about it until I saw that medal. And when I saw it, I—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I felt ashamed that it took that for me to see you differently." James's voice was calm, but sharp. "That's the problem. My worth shouldn't need a medal. It shouldn't take proof to deserve respect." Rick swallowed hard. "You're right." The waitress passed by, refilling James's cup. Neither man thanked her. Both were lost in the weight of the conversation. "You know," James said after a pause, "I didn't carry that medal to impress anyone. I kept it because it reminds me of the ones who didn't come home. Men who never had the chance to sit in a place like this again. Men who would have deserved your respect just as much as I do." Rick's eyes lifted. Guilt etched deeply into his face. "What happened to them?" James stared into his coffee for a moment before answering. "They gave everything, and sometimes it still wasn't enough to be seen." Rick sat back, letting those words settle in his chest like a weight he couldn't shift. "Why didn't you get angry?" Rick asked finally. "When I stopped you, anyone else would have argued. You just stayed calm." James's voice was quiet. "Because anger doesn't change minds. It only makes people stop listening. And I've spent my life in places where staying calm kept me alive." Rick nodded slowly, understanding more than he wanted to admit. The door of the diner chimed again as another customer entered, breaking the heavy stillness. But neither man moved. Rick took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the mug down. "I don't know how to make this right," he said, "but I don't want to keep being the man I was on that road." James studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Then don't. Start by seeing people as they are, not as who you've been told they are." Rick exhaled deeply. There was no easy answer, but for the first time, he felt the pull to try. James glanced at the clock. "I should go." He slid out of the booth, leaving a few bills for his coffee. Rick watched him walk to the door. Before leaving, James turned slightly, his eyes meeting Rick's one last time. "Next time you stop someone," James said softly, "ask yourself who you're really looking at." Then he walked out into the night, the door closing quietly behind him. Rick sat in the booth, staring at the empty seat across from him. He knew the conversation would stay with him far longer than he expected. The bell over the diner door gave a soft chime as James stepped out into the cool night air. He walked calmly to his car, his posture straight, his face unreadable. The quiet of the evening wrapped around him like a familiar cloak. Inside, Rick remained in the booth, staring at the half-empty coffee in front of him. The hum of the diner faded into the background as his thoughts replayed every second of the encounter. The stop, the medal, the words that had cut deeper than any argument ever could. He thought about all the other stops over the years, the faces he'd seen, the assumptions he'd made, the people he hadn't given a second thought to once they drove away. How many times had he been wrong and never known? The waitress interrupted his thoughts, placing the check on the table. "Anything else for you?" she asked gently. Rick shook his head. "No, thank you." She gave him a small, knowing look before moving on. Rick left a few bills on the table and walked out. The cool air hit him immediately. He spotted James's car in the distance, taillights glowing faintly as it merged back onto the empty highway. For a moment, Rick considered calling out, but what would he say? That he understood now? That he was sorry? Words felt too small for the weight of what he carried. Back in his cruiser, Rick sat in silence. He reached for the body cam clipped to his vest. It had recorded everything: his approach, his tone, his assumptions. He debated for a moment before saving the footage. Maybe it would serve as a reminder, or maybe as evidence of who he had been. Meanwhile, James drove steadily, the quiet road stretching endlessly before him. His thoughts drifted, not to Rick, but to the soldiers he had served with, to the friends who never came back. The medal was gone now, returned to where it belonged, but the memories, the weight of what it represented, would always stay with him. He pulled into his driveway just as the clock struck midnight. The house was dark and still. Inside, he set his keys down and sat at the kitchen table. He stared at his hands for a long time, thinking about how quickly things could change, how fragile dignity could feel when placed in the wrong hands. Across town, Rick sat in his patrol car, writing in his logbook. His pen hovered over the page as he hesitated. Normally, he would have written something simple: routine traffic stop. Cleared. But tonight, he couldn't bring himself to reduce it to a line of meaningless text. Instead, he closed the book and stared out at the quiet street. For the first time in years, he felt the urge to do more than just patrol. The radio crackled, calling him to another assignment. Rick picked up the receiver slowly. "Dispatch," he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. "I'll respond." But before driving off, he took one last look toward the highway, toward the place where he'd seen the medal glint in the sun. Something inside him had shifted, and even if the world outside didn't notice, he knew he couldn't go back to who he was before. The following day began quietly, but the stillness felt heavy, as if the world was pausing to reflect. James woke early, as he always did, his routine precise and deliberate. He brewed a simple cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the soft light of dawn creep across the neighborhood. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from Mrs. Daniels. "Thank you again for bringing it home. It means more than I can say." James typed a short reply. He deserved it, always. He set the phone aside. There was no need for more words. Across town, Rick was already in his patrol car, but today felt different. He drove slower than usual, his eyes scanning the streets with more thought than habit. Every person he passed, a man walking his dog, a woman waiting for the bus, a teenager riding a bike, felt less like a blur and more like someone he should really see. When he pulled into the precinct later that morning, he lingered in the parking lot for a moment. His hand hovered over the dash cam controls. He could erase the footage of the stop with James. No one would ever know. But he didn't. Inside, the station buzzed with its usual rhythm. Officers swapped stories, laughed over shared jokes, and filled out routine reports. Rick walked past them, quieter than usual. He sat at his desk, opening a blank incident report. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard. He typed, "Yesterday's traffic stop was different. It made me realize how easily we stop seeing the person in front of us. I need to change that." It wasn't an official report, just a note he printed and folded into his pocket. A reminder. Meanwhile, James spent the day running simple errands, grocery shopping, picking up a prescription, stopping at the post office. To anyone watching, he was just another man moving through an ordinary day. But everywhere he went, people noticed the way he carried himself, quietly confident, unshaken by the rush around him. In the afternoon, he stopped by the local veterans center. Inside, a group of younger soldiers sat around a table, their voices low as they shared stories only they could understand. James didn't join their conversation. He simply placed his hand briefly on one young soldier's shoulder, offering a silent reassurance before moving on. Back at the precinct, Rick stood in front of the locker room mirror. He removed his badge, staring at it. For years, it had been a symbol of control, of power. Now, it felt like a question. His partner, Mike, walked in. "You good, man? You've been quiet all day." Rick hesitated. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" Rick shook his head. "About how easy it is to forget people are more than what you see." Mike frowned, confused, but didn't press. That evening, Rick drove home without turning on the radio. The silence felt necessary. As he parked in his driveway, he realized this wasn't a single moment of guilt. It was the start of something he'd have to carry, and hopefully, something he could change. Across town, James sat at his kitchen table, the folded letter from the VA still unopened beside him. He stared at it for a while, then finally slid it into a drawer. The memories, he thought, were better left resting quietly, but some lessons needed to keep echoing. The following week moved slowly, but its weight lingered like an echo. For James, life returned to its quiet rhythm: morning coffee, brief errands, the occasional visit to the Veterans Center. Yet, beneath the surface, the encounter on Route 17 stayed with him. Not as anger, but as a reminder of how fragile dignity could feel when placed in the wrong hands. He didn't tell anyone about it. There was no need. James had learned long ago that not every battle was meant to be fought with words. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Rick found himself looking at his work differently. Each traffic stop now came with hesitation, not the kind born of fear, but of awareness. He questioned his instincts, questioned the snap judgments that had once come so easily. That afternoon, during a briefing, his partner Mike slapped him on the back. "What's up with you lately? You've been, I don't know, quieter." Rick forced a thin smile. "Just thinking about how we do things, who we're doing them to." Mike raised an eyebrow. "It's a job. You can't overthink it." Rick didn't reply. He just glanced at his badge again, the weight of it feeling heavier than ever. Later that evening, Rick parked his cruiser near the small diner where he had seen James. He didn't go in this time. He just sat in his car, staring at the neon sign flickering in the window. He wondered if James would be there again, sitting calmly in the corner booth with a cup of black coffee. But the diner was quiet. Only a couple of strangers sat inside. Across town, James stood in front of a small memorial in the park, a stone engraved with the names of soldiers who never came home. He placed a single white flower at the base, then stood back, his hands clasped behind him. Nearby, a young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, pointing at the memorial. "What's that, Dad?" The father knelt down, explaining softly. James overheard the words, but didn't interrupt. He knew some lessons were best learned quietly. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Mrs. Daniels again. The medal is on his photo now. It feels like he's finally back where he belongs. James allowed himself a faint smile before slipping the phone back into his pocket. That same night, Rick sat at his kitchen table, flipping through an old photo album his wife had left out. Pictures of his father, also a cop, filled the pages. He remembered the lessons he'd been taught about strength and authority, but never about seeing beyond the surface. For the first time, he realized there were gaps in what he'd learned. He closed the album and stared at his hands. They felt different now, not as steady, not as sure. But maybe that uncertainty was necessary. Maybe it meant change was possible. Out in the quiet city, the road stretched empty under the pale glow of streetlights. And somewhere beyond the silence, two men carried the same moment differently. One as a lesson learned long ago, the other as a lesson only just beginning. The days that followed unfolded quietly, but the encounter lingered in Rick's mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. Routine stops no longer felt routine. Each time he approached the car, he saw James's calm face in his memory, and it forced him to pause. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Awareness. During roll call at the precinct, other officers joked casually about their shifts, swapping stories about interesting stops and suspicious drivers. Rick stayed silent. He didn't laugh. He didn't join in. When the briefing ended, Mike caught up to him. "You good, man? You're not yourself lately." Rick hesitated. "Maybe that's the point," he said quietly. "Maybe I wasn't who I should have been before." Mike frowned. "It was just a stop. Don't overthink it." Rick looked at him, the weight of unspoken words in his eyes. Sometimes it's not just a stop. Sometimes it's someone's entire life, someone's dignity. Mike didn't respond. Meanwhile, James was spending his morning at the Veterans Center again. He sat with a young soldier named Carl, who was struggling with the transition back to civilian life. "It feels like no one understands," Carl admitted, his hands fidgeting. "Like everything we did. It doesn't matter anymore." James nodded slowly. "It matters. Even when people can't see it, it matters. You don't need their recognition to know your worth." Carl glanced at him. "Do you ever feel angry about how they treat you, out here?" James thought for a moment before answering. "Anger takes too much from you. Staying steady, that's harder, but it lasts longer." Carl nodded, unsure, but listening. Later that afternoon, James left the center and stopped at the same diner as before. He ordered a coffee and sat in the same booth, quietly observing the people around him. Life moved on. Waitresses pouring coffee, strangers talking softly over meals, the hum of an old jukebox in the corner. Outside, Rick's cruiser slowed as it passed the diner. He glanced through the window and saw James sitting there again, the same calm figure. He hesitated, gripping the wheel tightly. He could have kept driving, pretended the moment didn't matter anymore, but instead, he parked. Rick walked into the diner, the bell chiming softly overhead. James looked up, their eyes meeting briefly. Rick approached the booth. "I'm not here to bother you," he said quietly. "I just wanted to say, I've been thinking about what you said." James nodded once. "Good." Rick slid into the seat across from him. "I can't change what I did on that road, but I can try to be better tomorrow and the day after that." James studied him for a moment. "That's all anyone can do. Try." Rick let out a slow breath. "I don't know if it's enough." "It's a start," James replied. The waitress brought Rick a coffee without asking, sensing the conversation needed no interruption. For a while, they sat in silence. Two men from different worlds, bound by a moment that neither of them could forget. And for the first time in a long time, Rick felt like he was starting to see clearly. The diner hummed quietly around them. Soft clinks of plates, the faint buzz of an old jukebox playing a song no one was really listening to. Rick stared into his coffee, watching the steam curl upward like fragile smoke. James sipped his calmly, his expression as steady as always. After a long pause, Rick finally spoke. "You know, I've been on this job 10 years. I thought I'd seen it all, thought I knew how to read people. But I realized I wasn't really reading people at all. I was just reacting to what I'd already decided they were." James nodded slightly, not interrupting. Rick's voice grew quieter. "That day, I thought I was doing my job. But the truth is, I wasn't protecting anyone. I was just protecting what I was comfortable believing." James set his cup down gently. Comfort can be dangerous. It makes you blind to the truth that's right in front of you. Rick looked up at him, his eyes heavy with something deeper than guilt. Regret, maybe even shame. "I can't undo it. Any of it. The stops I made, the way I treated people, the times I assumed the worst." "No," James agreed. "You can't undo it. But you can decide how you act tomorrow and the day after. That's the only way it changes." Rick let those words settle. He glanced toward the window where the setting sun cast a soft orange glow over the empty street. For the first time, he wondered how many moments like this he had already missed. Moments where he could have seen the human being in front of him, but chose not to. "I never asked," Rick said finally, his voice hesitant. "What did you do to earn that medal?" James's gaze shifted slightly. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his tone was low, almost distant. "I didn't earn it alone," he said. "It was for the men who didn't make it back. I just happened to be the one who survived." Rick fell silent, realizing there was nothing he could say to that. After a moment, James stood. He placed a few bills on the table for his coffee. "Take care of yourself, Officer Harris," he said, his voice calm but firm. Rick looked up. "James, wait." James paused, glancing back. "I don't know if I deserve your respect after what I did, but I just want you to know I'm trying to be better." James studied him for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then keep trying." With that, he left the diner, the door closing softly behind him. Rick sat there for a while, staring at the empty booth. Outside, James walked toward his car. The air was cool, the world quiet again. He knew this wouldn't be the last time someone saw him for what they assumed, rather than who he was. But for now, he was content knowing that at least one person had started to see differently. And sometimes, one was enough to start a change. James drove home under the soft glow of streetlights, the road quiet and nearly empty. His hands rested steady on the wheel, his mind not on the day's events, but on the faces of men he once called brothers. Every time he thought of the medal, he thought of them. It was never about heroism, only survival. When he pulled into his driveway, he sat in the car for a moment before turning off the engine. The house was dark, silent. He didn't flip the lights on right away. Instead, he stood in the stillness, letting the quiet settle over him like a familiar friend. Across town, Rick sat alone at his kitchen table. His wife was working late, the house empty except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. The badge he had worn for years lay on the table in front of him. For the first time, it didn't feel like a symbol of pride. It felt like a question. What did it really mean to serve and protect if he couldn't even see the people he was supposed to protect? He poured himself a glass of water and stared out the window into the darkness. His mind kept circling back to James's words. Respect shouldn't depend on what you see after the fact. Rick thought of all the times he'd been quick to stop someone for looking suspicious. All the times he assumed the worst without proof. He couldn't erase them, but he could feel the weight of them now, and that was something he couldn't ignore. The next day, Rick reported for his shift as usual. But when the calls came over the radio, he approached each one differently. Slower, more deliberate. He looked into people's faces before making decisions. He asked questions before making judgments. His partner Mike noticed. "You're taking your time more than usual. You feeling okay?" "I'm just seeing things differently," Rick replied, trying to at least. Mike didn't press further, but he watched Rick curiously for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, James visited the park where a small veterans memorial stood. A few people lingered there, an elderly couple leaving flowers, a young man staring quietly at the engraved names. James placed his hand gently on the cool stone. He didn't say anything. Words weren't needed here. Later that afternoon, James received a message from Mrs. Daniels. She had placed her son's Medal of Honor on the mantel, surrounded by family photos. "It finally feels like he's home," she wrote. James replied simply, "He always was." That evening, Rick stopped by the diner again. He didn't see James there this time. Instead, he sat in the same booth alone, drinking a quiet cup of coffee. He wanted to hold on to the memory, to the lesson, to the shift inside him that was still new and fragile. For years, Rick had believed the badge was enough. But now, he realized it wasn't the badge that made the man. It was how he chose to see others, and how he chose to act on what he saw. And somewhere across the city, James sat in his home, quietly content, knowing he hadn't needed to shout or demand respect. Sometimes, the calm truth was enough to make someone stop and see. The next morning, sunlight crept through James's kitchen window, warming the quiet room. He sat at the table with a simple breakfast, black coffee, a piece of toast. The day ahead was calm, uneventful, but he didn't mind. After years of living in chaos overseas, simplicity was its own kind of peace. He glanced at the folded letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs still tucked into the corner of the table. He hadn't opened it yet. Maybe he would later. Maybe he wouldn't. Not everything needed to be faced at once. Across town, Rick woke earlier than usual. He dressed in silence, his uniform feeling heavier than it ever had before. In the mirror, he looked at himself. Not the badge, not the gun, but the man behind it. For the first time, he wondered if he had truly lived up to the words, serve and protect. At the station, he requested a different assignment for the day, community outreach instead of patrol. His supervisor raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Later, Rick found himself at a local youth center, talking to a group of teenagers about safety, about trust, about responsibility. It wasn't a scripted talk. It was raw, honest. Look, Rick told them, his voice steady but sincere. I know a badge doesn't always feel like protection. I know sometimes it feels like the opposite. I can't undo the past, but I'm here today to tell you I'm trying to do better, and I hope other officers will too. The teens were quiet, unsure how to respond, but a few nodded slowly, listening. Meanwhile, James visited the Veterans Center again. He found Carl, the young soldier struggling to adjust, sitting quietly in the corner. Rough day? James asked, taking the seat beside him. Carl shrugged. Feels like no one really sees me. Just another face, you know? James gave a small nod. I know, but being unseen doesn't make you any less. It just means you have to hold on to who you are until the world catches up. Carl looked at him, the weight in his eyes, easing just a little. Later that afternoon, Rick drove by the diner again. He hesitated outside but didn't go in. Instead, he parked across the street and sat quietly in his car, thinking. He wanted to see James again, to thank him, not for the lesson alone, but for the patience it took to give it. Inside the diner, the same waitress poured coffee for a new group of regulars. She glanced out the window, noticing the patrol car lingering across the street. She didn't say anything. She just watched as Rick eventually pulled away, the cruiser blending back into traffic. That evening, James returned home and sat on his porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in muted gold. He listened to the distant sounds of the neighborhood, children laughing, a dog barking faintly, the soft hum of a car passing. For a brief moment, he thought of Rick, not with anger, not with resentment, but with quiet hope that maybe the officer would truly change. Sometimes, change didn't happen in loud, dramatic ways. Sometimes, it began with a single moment of seeing someone for who they really were. And once you truly saw, you couldn't unsee. The following day brought a soft drizzle, the kind that blurred the edges of the city and muffled its usual noise. James sat by the window with a cup of tea this time, watching raindrops streak down the glass. Outside, the street was quiet, just a few neighbors rushing past with umbrellas. He picked up the folded VA letter again. For a moment, he considered opening it, but instead, he set it back down. Some things could wait until the time felt right. Meanwhile, Rick drove his cruiser through the damp streets, the windshield wipers swaying back and forth in a slow rhythm. His mind wandered back to the youth center from the day before, the way the teenagers had looked at him, cautious but curious. He had told them he wanted to do better. He meant it, but he knew words alone weren't enough. At a stoplight, Rick saw a young man walking in the rain, carrying grocery bags that looked too heavy. Normally, Rick would have driven past, assuming it wasn't his problem. But today, he pulled over. "Need a ride?" Rick called out through the open window. The young man hesitated, eyes narrowing at the sight of the uniform. Rick kept his voice calm. "No questions. Just a ride. You'll stay dry." After a moment, the young man nodded. Rick opened the back door, and they drove in silence. When they reached the man's building, he simply said, "Thanks," before hurrying inside. It was a small thing, but Rick felt the weight of it. An action, however small, was still a start. Later that afternoon, James visited the park again. The rain had stopped, leaving the grass glistening with droplets. He walked to the Veterans Memorial, tracing a single name with his fingers. Beside him, a young boy placed a tiny American flag in the ground. "Was he your friend?" the boy asked, looking up at James. "Yes," James said quietly. "He was." The boy nodded solemnly, then ran back to his parents. James stood there a little longer, letting the silence honor the names carved into stone. At the precinct, Rick sat at his desk after his shift ended. He pulled out the folded note he'd written after his encounter with James. It was worn now from being opened and read so many times. "See people as they are, not as who you've decided they are." He pinned it inside his locker, where he would see it every day before he went out on patrol. That evening, Rick passed by the diner again. Through the window, he saw James sitting alone in the same booth, quietly sipping his coffee. This time, Rick didn't go in. He didn't need to. Instead, he parked across the street and watched for a moment, knowing some lessons didn't need more words. James eventually stood, paid his bill, and walked out into the soft evening air. He didn't notice Rick's cruiser nearby. He simply continued on, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had changed more than one man's perspective. And in that small, unseen moment, Rick understood that real respect was never about who people were on paper. It was about truly seeing them, even when no one else was looking. The days turned into a quiet rhythm. James kept to his routines: morning walks, occasional visits to the Veterans Center, evenings spent in stillness. The encounter on the road had faded into memory, but its echo remained. It wasn't the first time he'd been misjudged, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But he carried himself the same way he always had, with calm, unshakable dignity. One afternoon, James sat on a park bench reading a worn paperback. Across from him, two teenagers were tossing a football back and forth, their laughter breaking the calm. A young mother walked by, pushing a stroller. Life moved on in simple, quiet ways. As he turned a page, a shadow approached. He looked up to see Carl, the young veteran he'd been mentoring. "You always know where to find me," James said with a faint smile. Carl shrugged, his expression a little brighter than before. "It helps, talking to someone who gets it." James closed the book. "How have you been holding up?" "Better," Carl admitted. "Still feels like people don't really understand what we carry, but I'm learning to not need them to. It's enough that I know." James nodded. That's the first step. Meanwhile, across town, Rick finished another long shift. He didn't make any unnecessary stops that day, didn't rely on instinctive judgments. Instead, he spoke with people differently, slower, more deliberate, more human. Back at the precinct, he walked past his colleagues, joking in the locker room. He stopped at his own locker, glancing at the small note pinned inside. See people as they are, not as who you've decided they are. He touched it briefly before closing the door. That evening, Rick drove past the Veterans Center. Through the window, he saw a group of former soldiers sitting together, talking quietly. He wondered if James was inside. Instead of going in, Rick parked for a moment and watched. He thought about the countless times he had crossed paths with people who had lived more than he could ever imagine. People he had reduced to stereotypes in seconds. For the first time, Rick felt the weight of how much he didn't know. Later that night, James sat at his kitchen table again. He finally opened the letter from the VA. It was an invitation to speak at a local ceremony honoring Medal of Honor recipients. He read it slowly, then set it down. He didn't crave recognition. He didn't need applause. But maybe, he thought, showing up could mean something, not for him, but for the younger soldiers who still felt invisible. Outside, the night was calm. The streetlights cast soft pools of light across the quiet road. Somewhere not far away, Rick was sitting in his cruiser, finishing his shift in silence. He didn't know why, but he found himself driving toward that same diner again, even though he didn't expect to see James there. Sometimes, he thought, it wasn't about making amends. It was about carrying the lesson forward, letting it change the way you saw everything after. And for the first time in his career, Rick felt like he was finally learning how to see. The ceremony was held on a bright Saturday morning at the city's civic center. Flags lined the walkway, and a crowd slowly gathered. Families, veterans in uniform, young cadets standing tall in crisp attire. James arrived quietly, blending into the background, as he always did. He hadn't planned on attending, but something about the letter had lingered with him. It wasn't about the medal. It was about showing the younger soldiers that their sacrifices wouldn't be forgotten, even if the world didn't always see them. Inside, the room buzzed with quiet anticipation. Rows of chairs faced a stage draped in banners. On the front row sat widows and children holding photos of loved ones who never made it home. James scanned the faces, his eyes pausing briefly on each one, acknowledging the weight they carried. When his name was called, there was polite applause. James walked to the podium with measured steps, the medal pinned discreetly to his jacket. He didn't give a long speech. I stand here today, he began, his voice calm, not because I was braver than anyone else, but because I came back when others didn't. This medal is for them, not for me. It reminds us that heroism isn't about being seen. It's about doing what's right, even when no one is looking. The room fell silent. Heads nodded. Some eyes welled with quiet tears. Meanwhile, outside the civic center, Rick stood across the street. He hadn't been invited, but he had read about the ceremony in the paper that morning. Something compelled him to be there, not to interrupt, not to insert himself, but just to witness. From a distance, Rick watched as James stepped down from the stage, greeting a few fellow veterans with quiet handshakes. He could see the way people approached him, not with loud admiration, but with a kind of quiet respect that spoke louder than applause ever could. Rick stayed hidden in the crowd. He didn't approach James. He didn't need to. Later that afternoon, James visited the park memorial once more. He placed another white flower at the base of the stone, his fingers lingering over a familiar name. Across the park, Rick arrived, out of uniform this time. He walked slowly toward the memorial, but stopped a few feet away when he saw James there. For a moment, Rick just stood, hands in his pockets, watching silently. James didn't turn around, but somehow he seemed to sense the presence. He didn't speak, didn't move. He simply stayed there, honoring the memory of someone long gone. Rick finally stepped forward, placing a single small flag at the edge of the memorial. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. James glanced at the flag, then at Rick. Their eyes met briefly, and in that quiet exchange, no words were necessary. It was an acknowledgement, not of forgiveness, but of understanding. The two men stood there together for a long moment, honoring lives that had shaped them in different ways. When the Vang finally walked away, they didn't go together, but neither felt as distant as they once had. Some lessons didn't need to end with closure. Some were meant to keep unfolding quietly, day after day. The city felt quieter after the ceremony. Life moved on, but the weight of that morning lingered in subtle ways, on the faces of those who attended, in the careful silence of those who simply watched. James returned home in the late afternoon. He placed his jacket with the medal still pinned neatly over the back of a chair. It wasn't a trophy to him, just a reminder. He poured himself a glass of water and sat by the window, letting the soft hum of the neighborhood fill the room. Across the city, Rick drove his cruiser without the radio on. His shifts had been different lately. He approached people slower, asked more questions, listened more. He found himself noticing the small details, how a person's shoulders slumped when they were nervous, how their voice softened when they felt heard. It wasn't dramatic change, but it was change. Later that evening, Rick stopped by the diner. The same waitress greeted him with a nod, remembering his quiet visits. He slid into the familiar booth, the one where he'd sat across from James. As he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, he overheard a couple at the next table talking. "Did you see the news?" the woman asked. "The veteran who spoke at the ceremony today? He was incredible, so humble." Her companion nodded. "I heard he saved his entire unit. Can you imagine? And to think, someone like that probably gets treated like anyone else until they see the medal on his chest." Rick's hand stilled on the spoon. He glanced toward the window, lost in thought. Exactly, he thought. That's the problem. Meanwhile, James stepped outside his home for an evening walk. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. He passed a few neighbors who nodded politely, unaware of who he truly was or what he'd done. And that was fine. James didn't need them to know. Respect wasn't about recognition. It was about how you carried yourself, even when unseen. At the Veterans Center the next day, James found Carl waiting for him again. "I saw you on the news," Carl said, a hint of pride in his voice. "You didn't talk about what you did. You talked about the ones who didn't make it back." "They're the reason I'm here," James said quietly. "It was never about me." Carl nodded slowly. You think people will ever really understand? James gave a faint, thoughtful smile. Maybe not, but some will try, and sometimes that's enough. Later, Rick finished his shift and parked near the same park where the memorial stood. He walked up to the engraved names and stood there for a long time, reading each one. In that moment, Rick didn't think about himself as an officer. He thought about the people behind those names, the lives, the families, the sacrifices, and for the first time, he truly understood what James had meant. Respect shouldn't come after a reason. It should exist before the reason is even known. Rick placed his hand on the cool stone, a quiet promise to himself that he would see differently from now on. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the park in soft twilight. Two men, in different parts of the city, carried the same memory in silence. The next few days unfolded with quiet steadiness. James continued his routine, his morning walks, small errands, and visits to the Veterans Center. People there greeted him warmly, especially after the ceremony. But even with their gratitude, he remained humble, never seeking more than a nod of acknowledgement. One afternoon, he sat with Carl again. The younger veteran seemed lighter now, his shoulders less tense. I've been thinking, Carl said, maybe I can volunteer here. Help the new guys who are struggling like I was. James gave him a small, approving nod. That's how it starts. You carry forward what you've learned. It's the best way to honor the ones who didn't come back. Carl smiled faintly, the first genuine smile James had seen on his face in weeks. Meanwhile, Rick was adjusting to his new way of working. His stops on patrol were different now. Not rushed, not assumed. He noticed things he hadn't before. The fear in someone's eyes when they saw flashing lights. The way their hands trembled even when they had done nothing wrong. He spoke with calmness, explained his reasons, and listened. Really listened. His partner Mike noticed the shift. You're slowing down a lot more these days, Mike commented as they sat in the cruiser between calls. Yeah, Rick said simply, because sometimes we need to slow down to really see. Mike didn't push further. He just nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Not yet. That evening, Rick stopped by the park again, drawn to the memorial like a silent habit. A small crowd was gathered, families, veterans, strangers leaving flowers or flags. Among them, he saw James standing quietly, his hands clasped in front of him. Rick didn't approach. He stayed at a respectful distance, watching as James placed another single white flower at the base of the stone. After a moment, James stepped back, his eyes lingering on the engraved names. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't stay long. He simply turned and walked away, his presence as quiet and steady as ever. Rick remained by the memorial after James left. He thought about how much had changed in him since that first encounter, and how much still needed to change. Later that night, James returned home. He poured a cup of tea and sat by the window, the soft glow of the street lamp spilling into the room. For a moment, his thoughts drifted back to the traffic stop, to Rick's face when he saw the medal. James didn't hold anger for the man. He held hope that maybe their brief encounter had planted a seed, that maybe Rick would carry the lesson beyond just one moment. Across town, Rick sat at his kitchen table again, staring at the folded note pinned inside his locker earlier that day. See people as they are, not as who you've decided they are. He whispered it quietly to himself, like a promise. The city outside continued on, unaware of the quiet shift happening in two men who had crossed paths in a way neither expected. And sometimes that was enough. A week later, the city was alive with its usual rhythm, cars rushing down busy streets, children laughing in parks, people hurrying to their routines. But for James and Rick, life had shifted in small, almost invisible ways. James spent his morning at the Veterans Center again. He helped Carl fill out forms for a volunteer program, guiding him through the process with patient care. The young veteran's confidence was growing, his voice steadier, his eyes brighter. James knew it would take time, but it was a start. Afterward, James took a quiet walk through the park. The sun was soft, the air cool. He paused by the memorial once more, laying another simple white flower at its base. He didn't stay long. He never did. For him, honoring the past didn't mean lingering in it. Across the city, Rick was finishing his shift. It had been an ordinary day on paper, but it didn't feel ordinary anymore. He'd stopped a car earlier, a routine traffic violation, but this time he had approached calmly, introduced himself, explained the reason for the stop without assumptions or suspicion. The driver, an older man, had thanked him for treating him with respect. It was a small interaction, but it stayed with Rick. After clocking out, Rick drove, not toward home, but toward the familiar diner. He didn't expect to see James there, but somehow the quiet place felt like a reminder of the turning point in his life. When he stepped inside, the waitress recognized him and nodded, placing a coffee in the same booth without a word. Rick sat there, looking at the empty seat across from him. He thought about the first time he'd seen James sitting there, calm and unshaken even after being treated unfairly. For a brief moment, Rick wished he could go back, approach that traffic stop differently. But he knew life didn't work like that. You couldn't rewrite the past. You could only choose what you did with the lesson it left behind. Meanwhile, James returned home and finally unfolded the VA letter that had sat on his table for days. It was another invitation to speak at an upcoming event honoring veterans. He read it, then folded it neatly again. He didn't know yet if he would go. Maybe he would, maybe not. His life wasn't about public recognition. It was about living quietly, carrying forward the dignity of those who didn't make it home. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Rick stopped by the park memorial once more. The flowers James had left earlier were still fresh. Rick stood there in silence, hands in his pockets, thinking of all the names carved into stone, people he'd never known, but now felt connected to through one man's quiet strength. In that moment, Rick understood that real respect wasn't something you earned after proving yourself. It was something you gave freely, because every person carried a story you might never see. And somewhere in the same city, James sat on his porch with a cup of tea, looking out at the fading light. Two men, once divided by assumptions, now shared an unspoken understanding. Sometimes change didn't arrive in grand gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes it came quietly, in a single moment that made you see the world and the people in it differently forever. And that was enough.